there's an internal tension in the whole understanding and application of halakha that applies in all areas of halakha. And it comes into today's piece of Gemara, and it's the tension between faithfulness to tradition and halakhic innovation. If you're not faithful to tradition, you risk authenticity. If you're not halachically innovate, you risk rigidity and fundamentalism. So there's got to be innovation, and there's got to be faithfulness to tradition and to authority. How do you balance that? And we're not going to be able to go through the whole issue. This is a huge issue, as you'll see. But the Matmonim, although each one stands on its own, I always think of it as each one is another paintbrush, a stroke of paint on a canvas that develops over 7 years as we go through Shas. On the one hand, each one is a gem on its own, hopefully, and it adds to a picture which develops. So this will add to the worldview we're developing as we go through the Gemaras, as we learn. We're building a worldview, and this is another stroke of paint on building that worldview of understanding how halacha works. Avodah Zarah, Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph. Tradition and innovation, ein beit din יכול לבטל דברי beit din חבירו, as we learn in the Gemara. Yesterday I mentioned I was having problems with the printer, and by midday Simon had stepped in and bought a new printer and made sure that when it will be delivered there won't be any problems. It's just added to my tension in the morning. The one tension is, am I going to have a Matmonim ready for you? The other one is the printer going to print. It's a little bit too much excitement for this time of the morning. So in this session, we'll have a printer that prints. Thank you, Simon. And we're dedicating this shir, although it's not yet the first shir printed on the new printer. We'll do it again when we have the new printer working. And the Torah that's learnt as a result of the printing that's done for this shir and for the Shabbos morning Medrash shir should be le'ilu in nishmasom of his parents, Maras Yehudi Shulamis Pastor Bilyoz the Spectre and Reb Shlomo David ben Reuven HaKohen. The two psukim that illustrate the tension I'm talking about are both in Dvarim. The one is Uvata ala Kohanim alavim ve'ala shofet asher yiyeh bayamim hahem v'darashta v'yigidu lecha et dvar hamishpat. You shall go to the Kohanim, Levim, or the Rabbonim, the Basei Din of that time, your time, and they will tell you what the halacha is, implying that the authority lies with the Beis Din of the time. And the other is in Ha'azinu Zechoyim Otalam Binu Shnoto Avado Sha'al Avicha V'Yagedecha Zechinecha V'Yoimru Loch. If you want to know the halacha, ask your father what the tradition is. What did his father do? What did his Zayda do? Ask the Kenecha, go to the old people in the community, the Chachomim in the community, and ask them what the Minhag is, what the Mesorah is. So on the one hand, authority is given to the Beis Din of the time, and on the other hand, there's a commitment to what has been done traditionally. The Gemara goes through a question starting off with the question of how could Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi have permitted a takona, a law that was instituted much earlier by the Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel. We're talking here about an attempt to prohibit the use of olive oil produced by non-Jewish producers, similar to the laws of wine. That takona never stuck. And the piece of Gemara goes into the whole question. How was it instituted? How was it undone? How did Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi have the right to undo it? And in so doing, the Gemara enunciates three axioms in this whole area. The one is, Ein beit din yachol levatel divrei beit din chaviro elem kein gadol hemene b'chochma v'minyan. One Beis Din cannot undo, nullify the decisions of an earlier Beis Din, that's the power of precedent, unless the later Beis Din is as great in wisdom and in numbers. And the Rambam goes into describing what do you mean by numbers? If a Beis Din of 71 made a decision, how can you have one that's greater than a Beis Din of 71? And he says it's about the number of chachomim, the number of authorities that accepted that psak of the Beis Din in the broader community, not just the Beis Din itself. The second axiom is Ho'el ufashat isuro berov Yisrael, that there are certain cases, and one is what we call the Shmoina Asodova, 18 things that were instituted in halacha, and if they're accepted by the majority of Yisrael, then even if Eliyahu Hanavi comes, you can't undo it. That's even more authority. The implication of that, however, is if something has not been accepted by the majority of Klal Yisrael, then one can undo it. And the third one is Ein gozrin gzeira ala tzibur elam kein rov hatzibur yochanin la'amod bo. A Beis Din is not allowed to institute a takona, a new law that they believe the majority of the community cannot accept. It's just too much, it's too cumbersome, and they're not likely to accept it. Those are the three axioms. The Rambam summarizes and legislates these three axioms in the beginning of the second parak of Hilchos Memri. And let's go through it. Let's learn the Rambam and the Kesef Mishnah on the Rambam, because this builds our worldview, this builds our hashkafa about this issue. And so much debate and so many arguments and so many misunderstandings are introduced into halachic discourse because of an insufficient understanding of these principles and axioms. In Halacha Aleph, Beit Din Gadol shedarshu ba'achat min hamidot kefi ma shenir'eh be'eneihem shadin kach v'danu din. If a certain Beis Din uses the 13 principles of extrapolation that Moshe taught us from Sinai, and using those principles come to a conclusion, va'amad achareim Beit Din acher v'nireh lo ta'am acher listor oto. And there's another Beis Din later on that learns the application of these 13 principles of extrapolation differently and comes to a different conclusion. That later authority has to paskin the way he sees it, not the way the earlier Beis Din saw it. Why? Shene'emar el hashofet ashiyeh bayamim hahem encha chayav lalechet el Beit Din shebedorcha. That's the pshat in the posuk. That's a mitzvah d'oraisa. It's a gzeras hakosuv. It's a law we're given, and it's stated in Parsha Shoftim that you go after the dayonim of your time, and even if he's a lesser authority, the authority, as the Gemara says, the authority of the Gedolei Yisrael of your time are as great as the authority of the Gedolei Yisrael in the time of Rabbi Akiva or earlier. You don't look at the whole of history in order to judge greatness of an authority in Halacha Aleph. You look at your generation and you measure relative greatness in your generation to relative greatness in the earlier generation. So if the top authority in your generation says something and it's different from the top authority of an earlier generation, then your generation's top authority and the earlier top authority have equal authority. And the halacha is you've got to go after your generation. So that's where we build in relevance. That's where we build in halachic flexibility and agility. That each generation has this power, in the Gedolei Yisrael of each generation have this power to adapt and to modify based on the way they understand the halacha. So you could ask, is it possible that some Gadol Yisrael who lives in our time in New York or in Bnei Brak is going to understand the Torah better than Rabbi Akiva? And does that mean he can make a decision against or better than a Beis Din 100 years ago in Eastern Europe? Is that likely? Well, it's not that he understands it better. He understands it better for today. He understands it better for the context. One has to use context. When you're learning, when you're applying halacha, when you're living Torah, context is part of it. It's not everything, but you can't work without context. Part of the context is historic context. What has been said on the topic in all the generations of Torah? And part of the context is environmental context. What world are we living in at the moment? If you look at the Torah through the lens of the world we're living in, what do you see? Or perhaps more accurately, if you look at the world we're living in through the lens of the Torah, what do you see? You might see something very different from what you would have seen 100 years ago. And the Chachomim of the time have to have that ability to paskin. The Poskei Hador, the great poskim of the generation, need that flexibility. Otherwise, you get locked into, you become fossilized, and you become fundamentalist, that principles that made a lot of sense then are applied blindly today. That's not what we want. On the other hand, of course, the principles are eternal, so that's part of this balance. So we get into halacha beis. Beit din shegazra gzeira or tiknu takana v'inhigu minhag. If a Beis Din made a law, or they were mesaken a takona, they fixed something, they introduced a new idea, something to make life better. V'inhigu minhag, or they started a custom. Upashat hadavar b'chol Yisrael, and this now became accepted by all or the majority of Israel. ועמד אחריהם בית דין אחר וביקש לבטל דברים הראשונים ולעקור אותה התקנה ואותה הגזרה ואותה המנהג. And another Beis Din later on comes and says times have changed. We don't need this takana anymore. It says after all, asher yiyu bayamim ahem, we have an authority to undo what that earlier Beis Din did. Eino יכול עד שיהיה גדול מן הראשונים בחוכמה ומניין. Now you've got to be greater than them, not just you, the greatest in your generation. You've actually got to be greater than them before you can challenge a gezerah or a takana. Afilu batel hatam shebigalo gezerah rishonim. You can't even be smart and say, yes, I know why they introduced the gezerah then. Then there was such an issue. Today that issue doesn't apply. That issue is no longer relevant. That doesn't matter. They're not allowed to be mevatelet. And then in halacha gimel, b'ameh dvarim amrim dvarim shelo asru otam kedei lasot siag laTorah ela kishar dinei haTorah. This that provided they're greater than the previous Beis Din, they can undo it. That is only if what was instituted wasn't a siag. It was a gezerah, a takana, or a minhag, but not a siag. A siag is a fence, is something that the Chachomim institute so that you don't come to do something worse. We discussed that yesterday, the idea of a Gezerah D'Rabbanan and Rabbeinu Yonah's comment in Shari Tshuva, that that's an expression of Yirat Shamayim, of making it more difficult to cross the boundary. So they build that fence to make sure that you don't even come close to where the problem is. If it's a siag, then advarim sheru beit din ligzor osan lasot siag, in pashat isuro bechol Yisrael, once it becomes accepted, ein beit din gadol acher יכול לעקרן ולעתירן אפילו היה גדול מן הראשונים. That's done. There's no way that can ever be undone by another Beis Din, even if they are greater than the first Beis Din. So in halacha aleph, we're talking about your reasoning. A psak halacha is reached by a Beis Din or by poskim of a generation through a process of reasoning, and later on another posek reasons differently and comes to a different conclusion. That's part of halachic evolution. If it's a gzeirah, a takana, or a minhag, some piece of legislation to make the world better, then you've got to be better than the earlier Beis Din in order to undo it. However, if it's a siag, it can never be undone. And based on yesterday's shiur, we understand that because the siag, when they build a fence, it's not just so that you don't come to do that Avera, as we discussed yesterday. That's an expression of Yirat Shamayim. So once they've built a measure of Yirat Shamayim, of God-fearingness, of Yirat Chet, of fear of sin, they've built that into Jewish life. Undoing it would be undoing the Yirat Shamayim. You can't undo Yirat Shamayim. You can undo if it's just a technical law, but a siag is not just the technical law we learned yesterday. A siag is much more than a technical law. It's also a piece of Yirat Shamayim. So that's the Rambam, just that you get an idea of the spectrum of looking at this and why it's so difficult to get to halachic decisions, because you've got to understand, does this fit into halacha aleph, into halacha beis, or into halacha gimel, as we look at new situations. There's a fascinating Kesef Mishnah, that's of course the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch, in his writing on the Rambam, explains where the Rambam gets it from, and he says the Rambam gets it from the fact that we see in the Gemara that earlier ones disagree with later ones. We see that happening all the time, that later Amoraim disagree with earlier Amoraim, and so on. So he realizes from the way the Gemara is developed and is structured that agility is built into the system, that you must be able to question earlier decisions and you must be able to come to different solutions. V'im tomar, and then he asks an important question. Im kein amai lo pligi amorai atanai, daha b'chol duch l'makshin l'amora mimatnitin mibraisa. Why can somebody in the Gemara, an Amora from the time of the Gemara, not disagree with the Mishnah? Why does there seem to be a barrier? I can disagree with an earlier authority in my general era. So if my era is the time of the Amoraim, from the year 200 approximately to the year 600 or so, 500, during that period, I can disagree with somebody in that era, even if he was greater than me, based on halacha aleph, on the first halacha in the Rambam. But I can't disagree with a Tana who might have been 10 years earlier. If I live in the year 300, I can't disagree with somebody who lived in the year 150. But if I live in the year 500, I can disagree with somebody who lived in the year 250. Why is that? וצריך לומר, אנא דאמרי כי היי תנא ואם לא, יאמר כן קשיא ליה, וכי דברי רבינו, הרשות ניתנה להם לחלוק על דברי התנאים, surely they should be able to challenge תנאים, ואפשר לומר שמיום חתימת המשנה, what you've got to say is from the time that Rebbe signed off on the Mishnah, קיימו וקיבלו שדורות האחרונים לא יחלקו על הראשונים. There was a global decision of poskim that the Mishnah is not, cannot be challenged. The whole community of poskim went through the Mishnah and accepted it as halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai. This is what has to be. וכן עשו גם בחתימת הגמרא, שמיום שנחתמה לא ניתן רשות לשום אדם לחלוק עליה. And the same applies at the end of the Gemara. When Ravina and Rav Ashi tied up the end of the Gemara, the Chachomim of the time got together and agreed nobody in the future can challenge the Gemara. You've got to learn within the system of the Gemara. You can't challenge from outside of the system of the Gemara. You can go into the Gemara learning, and within it you can reason and you can question, as we see in Halacha Aleph, but you can't disagree with the Gemara if you don't have a basis to do so. And that's why in the Biur HaGror that we pay so much attention to in the Shulchan Aruch, he goes so out of his way to make sure that every halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, he links to the Gemara, because that's what gives it its authority. The reason we keep the halacha is not because it says so in the Shulchan Aruch. The reason we keep the halacha is because it comes from something in the Gemara. And if it doesn't come from something of the Gemara, there is place based on this to argue, and the poskim of the various generations have argued even on the Shulchan Aruch, but not if it comes from the Gemara and you don't have another source in the Gemara from which to challenge it. There's a beautiful piece that of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. He used to give a shir on the yortzites of his mother and of his father, and later on of his wife, and they were wonderful, wonderful shiurim. And some of them have been published. One of them is a shir that he gave in memory of his father and the yortzeit of his father, called Shtei Sugei Mesoret. There are two types of Mesoret. And it's a lot of it is based on the sugi, but it's a long piece. And I just wanted to learn one piece from that, because that really helps us understand the general approach. Shtei Mesorot yeshnan, there are two Mesoris. מסורת אחת המתייחסת כולה למסורה של לימוד, ויכוח, משא ומתן והוראה שכלית. One Mesorah is how to learn and how to paskin. זה אומר כך וזה אומר כך, and so on. And then there's a decision at the end of the day, there's a psak, and the halacha comes out of that, but it's based on reasoning, on logic, on extrapolation. That's one Mesorah, that we have one set of Mesorah. But there's another Mesoret Ma'asit Shel Hanagat Klal Yisrael. We see from this Rambam and from our Gemara that there's another type of Mesoret when Klal Yisrael has adopted a practice. That's a power of its own, not because of the legal reasoning that went to determining that practice. The adoption of the practice by Klal Yisrael makes it a halacha of the strongest form, one that it's hardest to question or to go against. And that's based on Sha'al Avicha v'yagedecha zekenecha v'yomer lach. So explains the Rambam, there are two Mesoros. One is based on the shoftim of your time, and one is based on go back to the original source. And then he brings the famous case of the argument between his grandfather, Rabbi Yoshe Ber, the Beis Halevi, and the Rajina Rebbe. The Rajina Rebbe was the person who discovered Tchelet. And he made the halacha that he told his followers, and it was adopted by others, and still today it's an issue, that we now know what Tchelet is, and we know where it came from. All these years we didn't know. Now we know, and one should wear Tchelet. That's the way he passed it. The Beis Halevi disagreed. And the basis of the Beis Halevi's disagreement was that even though many proofs were brought by the Radzina Rebbe, and they were great proofs, ki hatzeva hu ke'emet atchelet, Rabbi Yosef Ber to'an keneged v'amar she'ein ra'ayot u'svarot yecholot le'ochiach shum davar b'mili d'shaychi le'mesoret shel sha'ar avicha v'yagedecha. If you classify a practice into the area of Sha'al Avicha v'yagedecha, you can't challenge it with an argument. You can't challenge it with facts. You can't challenge it with reasoning. The Torah tells us the source for that practice is, what did your grandfather do? What did your great-grandfather do? That becomes the halacha no matter what other arguments there are. All that can decide that is the tradition, the Mesorah. That's what the fathers saw their fathers do, and that's what the sons need to do. That's the second set of Mesorah. And so I'm not getting into the issue, and there are big poskim today who say one should wear tchelet, and there are big poskim today who say one shouldn't wear the tchelet. There's nobody who says one may. There's not a may in this thing. Either you're doing right by wearing tchelet and wrong if you don't, or you're doing right by not wearing tchelet and wrong if you do. And how you reach that decision now depends on your whole method of Masorah and learning. Are you going to go with the Beis Halevi's tradition of understanding halacha? Then all sorts of things result from that, including whether you wear tchelet or not. You can't just take one thing from this tradition and another thing from the other tradition, and then you get this fruit salad of mixed minhagim and practices that don't have a basis in halacha and in tradition. It's just such amaratzut. It's such ignorance to do that. And that's why it's important to have rabbeim who are able to guide one and to explain to one when it's one Masorah, when it's the other, when we're bound by it, when not, how we're bound by it, why we're bound by it. It's not just each thing to be evaluated on its own. There's context. What's the worldview, the halachic worldview to which I belong? What's the school of halachic thinking to which I belong? Because that determines the lens through which I interpret halakha and how I put it into practice. And it might be different from the person next to me, and that's okay. What isn't okay is if I pinch one of your practices and I plug it into mine. That's the problem. The problem is not two people who consistently follow a different worldview and practice differently. One wears tchelet and one doesn't. Both are fantastic. No problem. As long as they're two consistent worldviews. And we're living in a time where there's such confusion, not only in Torah, but even in Torah, where there's such a confusion of identity. I don't know who I am. In the secular world, that's gone as far as people not knowing what gender they are. In the Torah world, it goes to, I don't understand what minhag I follow. I don't know who my identity is. I don't know which school of thought I belong to. I don't know which halachic system I follow. I just take from whatever I see. It's like you go and you chap and you put it together in some kind of form and you think it's going to work. It's like you want to build a computer and you don't know anything about computers. You just chap little pieces of components you find all over the place. Take a piece out of your computer, take a piece out of your computer, weld them together, and the thing isn't working, and I don't know why. Two different computers can be built very differently, and they can both work. When you try and borrow from one to the other and you're not following a system and you're not following a proper circuitry, that's when it becomes difficult. So one of the things as we develop in halacha and as we develop in understanding Torah, is important to develop the context of our identity. What's going on in the world and where do I fit in to all of this that's going in the world? Who am I? Where do I come from? What's my background? What's my tradition? How do I understand the Torah and how do I practice the Torah so that I can live in a world where at the same time there's a fierce adherence to tradition and an equally fierce willingness to adapt to times and to relevance in a way which is according to the Masorah, according to the tradition that's been handed down to us.